Alright guys, we have a 15-10 rapid game on the board against a player rated 399. So what we're going to do is we're going to be looking for the areas where somebody rated around the 400 mark needs to be focusing and growing. Now what's interesting is I've got the white pieces here and my opponent's actually replied to d4 with e5, the England Gambit, which is something I've been playing myself recently. It's part of my repertoire. I'm going to go ahead and take the pawn just for fun and see if my opponent plays knight to c6. Okay, so he's come out straight away with a check. Okay, so what you need to ask yourself is, in the opening, is this an attack that is a useful attack, or is it actually something that your opponent can get out of very easily and potentially even to do so while developing? So for example here I could play c3, okay, and that would have the effect of kicking the bishop, and the bishop will have to move. Then I gain what's called a tempo, which means that my opponent has now had to use a second move to move the bishop, and what I've done is actually I've slightly improved my pawn. The pawn is now in the way of the king, so it's helping to protect my king, plus it's allowing my queen to come out into the board, potentially as well. So I think right now that's a reasonable move. It means this pawn is still pinned. The pawn cannot progress because the king would be in check. So I'm playing now knight to f3 to defend this pawn. Now you shouldn't try too hard when there is a gambit on the board to defend your extra pawn. That's very often the trap. So how will I continue here? I think e4 looks like a very reasonable move. That will help release my light squared bishop and help my king to castle. e3 is not actually so good. It seems like it's more conservative, but in fact it blocks off this bishop here, and that bishop won't be able to get out into the board so easily. I also have b4 as an idea. Kick the bishop one more time, it'll have to go back there. But I think e4 looks like the most solid continuation from here. Okay, and now we have d6. Now what that allows me to do is to double my opponent's, well actually give my opponent an isolated pawn. So I only just put my teeth in today. So if I capture this pawn now, right, and the c recaptures, then it looks like, okay, black's still got a central pawn. The central pawns are on these two files, D and D, right? These two. However, it's also going to be an isolated pawn, and that means that it doesn't have a buddy on the E file, and it doesn't have a buddy on the C file, so those pawns cannot work together. Similarly, if my opponent here had captured with a queen, I could have captured with a queen, forcing C to take the queen, and we'd have the same position. Okay, so now the pawn has taken. So now what I want to do is I want to develop my bishop. I've only got one minor piece out in the board so far, but I have a reasonable pawn structure and I'm fairly close to castling. So I'm thinking bishop out here, pinning the knight seems like a reasonable move. I could also move my bishop to c4, then targeting the f7 square up here. So that seems to make some sense as well. I'll leave the bishop there, because I think if I put the bishop here to pin the knight, it would have allowed black, just prompted black to develop his light squared bishop. And then my pin is no more. And what's the point of that? So here, also notice that because I've moved the c3 pawn, I could actually now pop my queen onto b3 and have what's called a barrage. So I've got two pieces. I've got the queen and the bishop looking at that c7 square. Now, my opponent has developed his last knight, and that's a good move. It means he's preparing to castle kingside. I would very much like to prevent my opponent from castling, if I can, in any way. So one idea might be to attack the knight with my e-pawn. Let's say the pawn takes. I could capture the queen, but then he's got a knight and a bishop that could recapture. So that doesn't stop him from castling. playing my queen to b3 doesn't stop him from castling, because he castles, his rook's going to end up on this square, thereby defending this pawn. So that's not a convincing attack. The other thing as well is that the knight is actually attacking this pawn that is currently undefended. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and castle now. And if the knight gets greedy and takes the pawn, I've got rook e1 or queen e1 or queen e2. Right, here we go. So now what this knight has done is he's grabbed the pawn, so we've now captured 2 pawns each, but he's also put himself into a pinnable position. So the knight here is undefended, and now if I say move my rook to e1, this knight cannot legally move on the next turn. Right, if the knight moves, then it's leaving the king in check, and that is not permitted in the game of chess. Okay, so this is again a good response actually. So he's defending the pawn, so he's defending the knight with the d-pawn, which means that now I cannot capture with a rook, and he's also attacking my bishop at the same time. So if I was to take the pawn, the queen comes out, the knight's still defended, I can't capture then. I do have potentially bishop g5 attacking the queen, but then we'll probably get f6. I kind of like that idea. But one issue with that as well is, of course, we've got the queen attacking there. The knight could also cover that square, but remember the knight is still currently pinned, so it cannot legally move. Counting attackers and defenders, I actually have 2 attackers on the d5 pawn. So bishop takes or queen takes, either way would be quite an interesting move. So I'm going to capture with the queen. The reason is it threatens checkmate on the next turn, so it pretty much will force, or should force, the exchange of queens now. And then when queen takes, black can't castle on the next turn because he'll lose his knight. Wow, okay. Interesting play. Interesting play from a 400 rated player. So let's think this through now. I can simply capture the knight. I think that's probably the best move. It will actually win the queen, or at least win a big exchange, queen for a rook. Black doesn't have any checks at this point, and the queen is now pinned against the king, so that means the queen cannot legally move off the e-file. So the only real option is queen takes rook. Should the king castle, we've got, oh, okay, that's interesting too. Okay, that's another good move, well done. If bishop takes, rook takes, I don't really benefit in any way from that. I could capture the bishop with my rook, or I could simply sidestep the whole issue. Can't capture this bishop, it's defended by the knight. Now the bishop is actually pinned to the queen. The bishop can't really move. So what I might do here is think about maybe some kind of other attack. So I could maybe attack this pawn here. Bishop can't take my bishop because rook takes queen. If queen takes, so if I play queen here, then queen takes, knight takes, that looks okay. I'm going to go for that option. I think my opponent's playing pretty well actually. So you would normally expect more blunders than this at this level. Remember, the bishop's still pinned. I have one attacker, 2 attackers on the bishop, and the bishop has 2 defenders. So I could capture, which would force the pawn to capture, and that would kind of weaken the king's safety on this side of the board. I'm also threatening, of course, to capture the queen and the bishop. All right. Okay, so it's threatening my queen, but what that means is I can capture the bishop. Now if I capture the bishop, pawn takes queen, rook takes queen, knight takes rook, and I'm not particularly My position hasn't improved there. Can throw in a check, queen h5 check. That might be interesting. It's really good in chess to kind of maintain these pins when you can get them. So what I've got now is I've got some pressure on my opponent's position. And what that means is that it's reducing my opponent's options. So it's nice to be able to keep that pressure up. So I'm thinking, yeah, move the queen, and I think the most aggressive approach is queen h5. If he pushes another pawn now, it's really weakened his king side, because when his king castles then, these pawns are going to be in front of his king, and that's going to be harder to defend. If I put my queen here now, for example, the king cannot castle because he can't pass through check, and he'd be in check on that square. So I could move my queen to h6, or just back here. All of these squares are unavailable. Could put my queen on here, potentially. I like the look of this move. Bishop still can't move, so on the next turn I can simply capture the bishop with my rook and win the queen again. If bishop takes, I win the queen. But then we've got a queen for a rook and a bishop. That's not too bad an outcome for my opponent, but that's simply a poor move. So now I'm getting the queen for a rook. Let's just check this, so I don't want to. I'm going to drop that on my king. There's no checks, no good checks. But I think simply grab the queen when you get the chance. Makes a lot of sense. Okay, king has to take now, and now what we've got is a situation where the king is in the middle of the board, and now it really is time to come in and attack. So what I'd love to do is get my remaining rook into the game as well. But that means moving my knight and my bishop. Now I can't really move my knight and my bishop now with any kind of threat or aggression. So I think I'm going to throw in a check here. Nothing can block the check, which means the king has to move, and black cannot capture the attacking piece. So he can't go here, here, anywhere on here, or there. Alright, so you can see now the king is now coming out into the board, and that allows me to develop my dark squared bishop, but with check. And that's the beauty of it. Okay, so now the king is attacking the bishop, and the bishop is undefended. So we need to be fairly careful. Now I could defend my bishop by moving my knight to either of these two squares. That defends the bishop, and it also allows me maybe to release my rook into the game. Should the king capture the bishop, I don't think there's a winning opportunity there that I can see easily. So I think the right move now is, I'm just going to develop my knight, defend that piece. Okay. Need to be slightly careful now about the back rank, because I only have one rook. So should black be able to double up his rooks on one of these open files? So the D and the E file are completely open right now. If he doubles up his rooks, then he could drop a rook down here. I have to take, and then his other rook comes down, it's checkmate, because my king has no squares to move to other than on the back rank, and they're all in check. And I don't have a piece guarding this square right now either. So, various ideas. I think b4 looks good because we've got the king and the bishop on one square between them, and that is open for a pawn fork. That would probably mean that either the knight or the bishop's going to capture, and then I can recapture with my pawn and give check again. So I'm maintaining the pressure on my opponent. And should the knight move as well, then I have this square here with check by the queen as well. So I'm thinking just a couple of moves in front. Okay, the bishop has captured, so I recapture with the pawn, And now if knight captures, I've got queen here with check. I'm just doing a sanity check before I release the piece. Now the king has a problem because the king cannot defend this knight. The king can't move there because my bishop has that square. Can't capture the bishop because it's defended by the knight. So the king now is going to, I think that's not even doable, because then I can simply capture with the queen defended by the bishop, you see. Very unpleasant situation now. And I'm going to give another check now. And we're getting close to a checkmate situation. Bishop is defended by the knight. And now my rook is free to enter into the game. Can't come to this square because of the bishop. Can't come to this square because of the rook. But the rook does have c1 potentially. Okay, now I can add another check. And I think this might even be checkmate now. I think all he can do is put his rook in the middle. Bishop takes. Okay, no, he's got to move. That's all right. Any other checks? I see one here, but that drops the bishop. And I had the opportunity then to capture the knight, and I didn't do it because I wanted to maintain the pressure on my opponent. I do have queen takes b7, and then if queen takes a7, that would be mate. He hasn't engaged his last rook yet, which is good news for me. Can't play my bishop here. Well, I can do, I suppose. Bishop there might be good, actually. If rook takes, I've got knight takes. So bishop here, obviously I'm threatening to capture there with bishop or even with the queen. So that looks pretty good. Let's play that move. If rook takes, I simply recapture. It's really important when you're growing in chess and trying to improve is to think about multiple possible moves. Now you see he's attacking my queen, but that was the real threat. Now his king only has one square he can go to, and now let's capture the rook. This comes with a discovered check because the bishop was in the way of the check, but now the rook falls and the king's in check, so we are okay. Now I can simply check here again. Could have also brought out my rook. That might have been a good idea. And let's throw in another check with this bishop. King now I think has to move into the corner. Remember, this bishop is under threat. Thinking my bishop might want to come back down to here, just to prevent any ideas of the rook coming down to d1. Just cover that square. Okay. Currently the bishop's undefended and attacked by the rook, so that's hanging. It's a hanging piece. I think bishop down to here looks reasonable. I'm significantly ahead in material now. I have a queen, I have two knights and a bishop, more than my opponent. My opponent has one extra pawn. So it's much, much easier for me to coordinate my pieces together so that they're protecting each other. Now this knight is defended, that knight is defended by the queen. So now I think queen here. So a blunder would be queen to c8 thinking it was checkmate, but that square is actually covered by the bishop. But if I move my queen here, that comes with check. And there are only two ways to stop it, and that is to interpose a piece. But you see, these pieces are both coming to different squares. So whichever one comes down to break the pin, I capture. And there you go, that's a checkmate. So I thought my opponent actually played pretty well there. Let's quickly go through the game again. The England Gambit. I take, bishop comes out a little bit prematurely, allowing me to get a free pawn move that is a useful pawn move. Bishop has to move. I develop my knight protecting the pawn. Knight comes out, e4, just helping to control the center. It means now that I'm controlling all 4 of these squares with my pawns. Pawn moves and I swap off my doubled pawn. So I'm 2 pawns up actually at this point. Recaptures the pawn, giving him an isolated d-pawn. So that pawn is not likely to survive very long in the game. I develop my bishop now to c4, looking at this target square. And potentially my queen can come behind it. We have knight out, and now I castle. Nice to castle early, get your king nice and safe, and then think about attacking. So he falls for this pawn. A bit of a poison pawn, because now I can play rook e1, and this looked like a good move at first, d5, but in actual fact the pawn is under defended. Got 2 attackers, only 1 defender, so I come in straight away, capture. Now we have queen moves in front of the king, and that allows rook takes knight with a pin on the queen. Bishop interposes to break the pin, which is a decent move. Now I come across with another attack on the queen, pawn push, check, another pawn push, weakening the king's side. Now I slide my queen in to black's territory, stopping black from being able to castle and get his king to safety, right? Very important. Bishop attacks the rook, but this was really a blunder. So in this situation, I've got 2 attackers against this bishop. Black could have dropped his knight back down to here to defend the bishop. Now there's 2 attackers, 2 defenders. So if I capture, knight can recapture, and then the rook can't capture because it just gets taken. But this was a blunder. Capture the queen, and now I'm well up in material. Check, check, not a check. But I'm bringing my knight out to allow my final rook to get into the game. Notice that this rook of black's never does really get into the game. Now we have a pawn fork because of the relative situation of these 2 pieces, and that loses another piece. Now I come in with another check because the knight is moved, freeing up the e7 square, and now another check and another check, and the king is now well out of safety. There's no protection around the king, and I'm threatening to come in and capture this. This knight again is now pinned, right? Very, very common tactic. A bit of a pointless attack on the queen because the queen can come in with check. Now I capture the rook with check, so it's another free piece, another check. King goes to the corner, another check with the bishop. And now I retreat my bishop, also guarding this square here. Rook comes out, and that is really the final mistake, because now I drop my queen onto the back rank. Now if this bishop and this rook could both retreat to the back rank onto the same square, then the rook could have just dropped down and chased my king away, my queen away. But as it happens, you know, if rook comes here, then queen takes rook and it's still check. Bishop comes here, then queen takes bishop and it's checkmate anyway. So the bishop comes back, and there we have checkmate. So there you go. What we're really talking about is a bunch of relatively basic chess tactics. I mean, chess is mostly about tactics, with obviously ideas of position, making sure your pieces are good, coordinating your pieces together so that they're all defending each other and that you are not opening yourself up to too many risks. That's very important. But, you know, we've seen quite a few examples of tactics here. We've seen a pawn fork. We've seen several pins. And we've seen the importance and the power of continuing to attack and playing forcing moves like checks and checkmate threats that force your opponent to have to do something probably that they don't really want to do, that doesn't improve their situation. And that's it. Fair play to my opponent, played a reasonable game, and certainly very surprising to see the England gambit played at the 400 level. But yeah, kudos. I think he put up a decent fight. So if you're around that level, those are the things that you need to be looking out for. If you analyse your games on chess.com, don't worry about inaccuracies or even really mistakes. You know, you're looking for major blunders. And when you make a blunder, it's really important to go back and say, okay, well, what did I do there? Why did I do that? And what did I miss? That's the key thing. You want to be learning these patterns of pins and forks and all those kinds of, there's not that many tactics in chess, but what you find is that they, as you improve, they overlay. You get tactics upon tactics, tactics within tactics, but it all starts with learning to recognize the basic patterns in there. So thank you for watching. I hope this has been useful for you. If you haven't subscribed to Chess Bootcamp, please do subscribe. The videos that I make are all about helping people to get to 1,000 and beyond. Just trying to help all the beginners out there. There's so many people playing chess right now. It's absolutely brilliant. And I want to help you improve. I want to help you win more games. I want to help you to enjoy playing even more. So please do think about subscribing. Other than that, I'll see you soon.